Welcome to Behavior Grooves, the podcast that explores stories, science, and secrets from the world's brightest thought leaders for the curious at heart. I'm Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. We like to explore human behavior that will improve your relationships, your well-being, and your organization by helping you find your groove. From best-selling authors to researchers, you will learn insights from the sharpest minds in behavioral science, including psychology, behavioral economics, and neuroscience.
Hey, Tim, we need to let our listeners know that we're on our way to our 250th episode. It's next week, and every single one of those episodes has been hosted on our provider, Podbean.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Podbean hosts our podcast episodes and distributes them through Apple and Spotify to over 100 other pod listening apps on iOS and Android. And we want to say that we are grateful that this episode, actually everything this month, is sponsored by Podbean. If you're curious, Podbean is the easiest way to create your own podcast. As Kurt said, we use Podbean to host Behavioral Grooves. And so just download the free Podbean podcast app. And from there, you can start, record, and publish your very own podcast in minutes.
Wow, Tim, it only takes minutes to do a podcast. I knew you were a slacker. You say it's hours and hours and hours. I don't get this. Anyway, Podbean provides everything you need to run your podcast, and you can record and publish episodes directly from the app on your phone. Cool. Download the free Podbean app today. That's Podbean. Check it out.
Okay, now let's get back to the fantastic guests that we have on this episode, Kurt.
All right. We always have fantastic guests, Tim.
True.
So this is just one more of the fantastic guests that we have. And that is Richard E. Nisbett. And he is a pioneering social psychologist and author. He is the Theodore M. Newcomb Distinguished Professor of Social Psychology and co-director of the Culture and Cognition Program at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. My God, I can't even talk because it was so long that I lost all my breath. Along with his collaborator, the late Lee Ross, they published dozens of papers and a book on the power of situations. Ross and Nisbett first met in graduate school, where they studied under the groundbreaking research of Stanley Schachter at Columbia University.
God, no kidding. And later, then with co-author Tim Wilson, the two made another groundbreaking observation. They noted that we can only identify, quote, what people think about how they think, but not, quote, how they really think.
Yeah, in addition to a huge body of research, Richard recently released a capstone book called Thinking, a memoir. And that's what we wanted to talk to him about.
Yeah, and so with that, during our month on context, we encourage you to sit back and get ready to fill your tank with high-octane cognition and enjoy our conversation with Richard E. Nisbett. Richard Nisbett, welcome to Behavioral Grooves.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
We are going to start with a speed round, and we'd like to just find out, what's your preference, coffee or tea?
Coffee.
Oh, that was quick. Not even a hesitation. Perfect. We sometimes get people that hesitate. All right.
I wish tea was my favorite, but I'm stuck with it. I need the jolt from coffee.
Fair enough.
I need the jolt as well. So, all right. Second speed round question. Which is a better way of communicating feedback to grad students? The grunt method or a thoughtful explanation?
Oh, grunt any day. I long ago gave up trying to be articulate and clear about philosophy of science. And I also
go ahead.
Well, no, we're doing a speed round, so
that's okay.
We
speed
can come
rounds
back
always
to
end up going into a long format conversation. So go ahead.
Well, I now have a theory about why you don't give people a verbalized rule for, this idea was a good one because it sort of narrows the focus of if you just grunt, they come away from this, gee, why didn't he like that idea, I wonder? And they think about it more, and they induce the rule that you're trying to communicate with your grunt.
So the grunt forces them to process that deeper in a more meaningful way for them.
Yeah, that's the theory. And
I like it.
And of course, it's easier for me in the long run.
Okay, who who would you consider the more absent-minded professor, you or Lee Ross?
Oh my God. I would like to say we're tied, but in fact, Lee is.
Okay.
Actually, Lee is, I don't know if you probably don't know, Lee just died, actually. And he was my dear friend for 55 years. The two of us would sometimes, we'd be going to a meeting and we'd get wrapped up in conversation and wandering around the town where the meeting was. And somebody gets a desperate phone call saying, "You guys are needed right now." Oh. So, but Lee is the wisest person I ever knew and the most oblivious. Now that seems impossible. Okay, I'll take one or the other. Don't try to convince me of both.
That's fantastic. All right. So actually, Tim has one more speed round question after this, but my last speed round question: is there an obligation to point out an error in a speaker's presentation, even if that person is a colleague or a student?
Well, sort of, especially if they're a colleague or a student.
Yeah.
And as I admit in the book, I'm not good about it. My advisor was terrific. He was frank. If there was an error in a speaker's talk, he would identify it in a perfectly polite way. I can't do that. I'm not wired so that I can do that easily. And I rarely have a severe criticism without either keeping my mouth shut or blowing up. But these are a real fault.
I had one other question that I had a difficult time crafting, because I wanted to sort of get your perspective. This was a bit of a musical thing. It was going to be Prokofiev or Presley, and then I was thinking, well, maybe it should be Beethoven or the Beatles. And then I was thinking, well, maybe it should be Bach or Bernstein. And then Joseph Haydn or Woody Herman. And looking for some, would you prefer sort of a modern rock and roll or jazz artist compared to a classical or neoclassical artist?
Well, my favorites are classical and rock and roll.
Okay, both.
Right. Yeah, right.
Well, we will talk more about that later. First, if you could, Richard, tell us a little bit about what was the catalyst behind writing Thinking?
The main thing is there are ideas that I thought, people would benefit from knowing, and they're not reading the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. So I just wanted to get the ideas out there faster. And the other thing is, I've always prided myself on being able to communicate to people. There's a favorite saying of mine: any scientist who can't communicate to a 10-year-old child is a charlatan. So I always have that in the back of my head, whoever I'm communicating with. So I thought I would be able to communicate in a way that could reach a large audience. And then finally, I wanted to write a book that might have some, at least, literary value. That is, people would read it for pleasure. And so far, it looks like that has been successful.
Yeah. It's this wonderful, almost walk down history of psychology, social psychology. The people that you have interacted with and had the pleasure of working with is the best of the best when we look back at this. And so that for me was one of the wonderful aspects about the book, is just hearing some of those stories. As you said, the literary part of this was really good. Is there a particular individual, and obviously you've had influences by a number of different people, but is there one of those many people that you have had the pleasure of either working with or being mentored by throughout your career that you say just stands out above the rest?
Well, Stanley Schachter was a great writer. He was very charming. In fact, at one point he said, on a paper we were working on together, he says, the facts are pretty slim here. We've got to write it very charmingly. So the writers that were sitting on my shoulders while I was writing the book were Malcolm Gladwell and Michael Lewis.
Yeah.
Because these guys can write, complex ideas in a way that's totally clear to anybody. Lewis is also particularly amazing. He wrote the book about Kahneman and Tversky.
Yeah.
And he got it all exactly right. And it's not simple stuff. And people who would have no psychology found it fascinating. So those are the two people I was trying to imitate.
Yeah. Well, speaking of Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman, you came to know their work pretty early on and were impressed, if that's a fair word, by the way that they were doing some of their work. What did you think of the development of this discipline of behavioral economics that sort of emerged out of this?
Well, my friend Lee Ross says, actually, behavioral economics is social psychology with a name change for business reasons. So, I mean, but he's a very good social psychologist. And I must say about Thaler, he actually read social psychology. I mean, he read me and Lee on social psychology. He took Kurt Lewin's ideas, he's the founder of social psychology, and did much more with them than either Lee or I did. I mean, the particular idea of Lewin, which I knew from, the first days of graduate school, which is when you're trying to get somebody to do something, instead of pushing them, think about removing the barriers. And Thaler did brilliant stuff with that. I mean, millions of people are going to have a good retirement because he removed the barrier. In this case, the main barrier is when you sign up for work and would you like to put aside 5% of your income for retirement? And most people would handle that. Most employers would have a box that you check, but that's effortful.
Yes.
So Thaler says, let's have that box be the box you check if you don't want to have money put into retirement. And the impact is absolutely enormous. And that should have been a trained social psychologist who came up with that.
Well, you bring up a very good point, is that behavioral economics obviously has built upon a wide variety of different venues and practices, but social psychology is really the key piece where they're taking all of this information. I found it fascinating when you were writing about this, is that you had talked about base rates, and then you were reading about Kahneman and Tversky, and they're talking about base rates, and it was overlap, but there was difference. Can you talk a little bit about the difference in how they were looking at base rates versus the way that you kind of were looking at base rates at that point, if you can recall that?
Well, essentially they were the same way in a major sense. People don't pay enough attention to base rates in their lives. I mean, they go, oh, and it's a movie with Cary Grant in it. Cary Grant's terrific. I'll watch that. And somebody who's sensitive to base rates, so wait a minute, is that a good movie by Cary Grant? Because not all of his movies were good movies. And
right.
One way to find out about that is to ask a few like-minded friends. And I'm not the sort of person who wanders the stacks in libraries looking for, offbeat books. I mean, I want evidence that this thing is really worth doing. I miss a lot of interesting things that way, but I also save a tremendous amount of time. So social psychology has some striking experiments that are incredibly important. The most important, in my opinion, being Milgram's, where you give the person is supposed to give steadily increasing electric shock to this pleasant-seeming 50-year-old guy. And at one point he says, hey, this is really hurting. After a while he starts to scream, and after a while he says, hey, I have a heart condition. And after a while after that he starts pounding on the wall. And, people keep going. I mean, they keep going to the highest point. 2/3 of people go all the way up to a position later, danger, severe shock, XXX. You tell this to people and they sort of believe you, but they don't really, because if you ask them, do you think the kid sitting next to you in class would have done that? They say, oh, no. Oh, give me a break. How about on the other side? You think he might? No, I really don't think. How about you? Oh, would you like me to punch you out? I mean, you cannot convince people by simply saying 2/3 of people do that. And it's not 2/3 of students. It's not 2/3 of paid people. It's people from all walks of life. He, by the way, said he never had anybody regularly turn him down except preachers and doctors. And the doctors would stop giving him a sermon about why he ought not to be doing this. But everybody else, almost everybody went further than you think you would ever go. I was trying to find ways to teach base rates for the behavior of subjects in social psychology experiments. And one thing you have to do, you have to show people, here's a random person from that study. And you show an interview with him that's just designed not to be informative. And you do that for 2 or 3 people, and they now believe you that what these people did are what people do in the experiment. So anyway, that was my base rate.
I'd love to get your explanation as to why it's so difficult for us to believe, getting back to the Milgram experiments, that when you ask someone, well, would you do this? No, of course I wouldn't do this. Would someone sitting next to me? No, of course they wouldn't. Why don't we connect to the fact that we will do those things?
Well, we have strong theories about human behavior, including our own. And that's why the Milgram experiment was so arresting. I mean, it first came out, people could hardly believe it. In fact, people didn't believe it. He had to have psychiatrists and psychologists sit behind a one-way mirror and watch the thing. And they couldn't believe what they were seeing. And without that, the experiment would have faded away. So they were looking at base rates in a very different sense. Their research was always much drier. They came from a mathematical psychology position, a cognitive psychology position, but in some ways tidier, because often they had the mathematical model to show what people ought to be doing. And then the other thing, they had something I didn't have. That is, they had the concept of the representative heuristic. The judgments that we make are heavily, heavily influenced by similarities and whether one thing is representative of another. And I immediately latched onto that, and that became part of my whole story.
Well, and a lot of your work has focused in on attribution and attribution theory in various different pieces. Can you, again, talk about what got you interested in that? I mean, some of your first studies with the utilizing the medicine and the shocks, and how long people were able to take that shock if they thought it was attributed to, or the feelings they were getting were attributed to something else, were fascinating. But what led you down that path?
Well, whatever reason, most of the early research I did was showing that people were making an error. And in the case of the shock experiment, the idea was give people a pill, tell them that it will, in effect, don't use these words, produce physiological arousal. And we give them the exact symptoms that people feel when they're getting electric shock. There's a heart rate increase, and the breathing rate becomes irregular, and the palms become a little bit sweaty, and so on. So we say this is a pill that's going to cause these effects, and then we say we're looking at the effects of this pill on pain sensitivity, and we're going to give you these steadily increasing electric shocks, and we'd like you to tell us when you first feel the shock, when it first becomes painful, and when it becomes too painful to bear. Other people get this same pill, which of course is a sugar pill placebo, but we don't give them these symptoms. And as it turned out, and this is astonishing, the people who've taken the pill that's causing arousal, they think, but which is really being caused by the shock, tolerate 4 times the amperage of subjects who don't. So they're making an error there. I mean, they're mistaking the source of the arousal. And then the other thing about that became really central to my career in a lot of ways is that after the subject had taken all this shock, I would say, well, you took a lot of shock. That's impressive. Why do you suppose you were able to take so much shock? And then they said, well, I used to build radios and I would get shocks. And so I'm sure that could have been valuable. So tell me, did you think about the pill at all? No. I mean, I was too busy thinking about that shock. So all in all, only 3 people ever mentioned the pill. And I would give them the theory. I said, here's what happened. I gave you a pill, which was a sugar pill, and I told you it was going to cause arousal. And I said, you're getting that shock, and you're getting more and more aroused. And at some point you think, well, wait a minute. I mean, yeah, they said, I'm getting that arousal just like they said. And so the shock is not as aversive. I never convinced a single subject that was what went on. They would say, well, that's very interesting. I'm sure a lot of people did think that way. But see, I used to build radios and I got so.
That is fantastic. I love that. Boy, our unconscious, right, is a very, very powerful thing. And I guess I'm just curious, because so much of your work has surrounded sort of the effects of the unconscious. What are you where are you at these days on the impact that the unconscious has in our behaviors and our decision making?
Okay, well, the first systematic research I did on it was to show you can expose people to some stimulus, you know what effect it's going to have on the person, and then sure enough, it does have that effect. And then you ask them, did that stimulus have an effect on you? People will usually deny it. I mean, the favorite study here is one with nylon stockings, women in a mall, and look at an array of 4 nylon stockings, and we'll ask them to judge the quality. So they systematically examine each one and give us a judgment. And it turns out that they're 4 times as likely to choose the last thing they've looked at than the first thing. It's a huge effect, which a lot of merchandisers are quite interested in. You don't dare ask them to say, excuse me, but do you suppose the position of those nylon stockings could have influenced your judgment? Because they look at you like either you're crazy or I'm crazy and I'm getting out of here. And that's, we did a dozen experiments like that. And incidentally, we were often wrong about what effect we thought the stimulus would have. They didn't do what we thought they would do. They did something else, but they were still wrong. I mean, so.
just in a different direction than what you had anticipated. Yeah,
that's right. And the conclusion from all that thing is that we don't have direct access to our cognitive processes, period. Nobody's going to quarrel with you if say you don't have direct access to your memory processes. They say, all I know is I went oomph and there it was. Or they don't have direct access to sensory process. They don't know how it is that they get from the stimulus to the visual image. We are under the illusion that because we know a lot of the things that went on in our heads, and because we have theories, some not good at all, about what kinds of things affect us, we're under the illusion that we know what affected us. And I think I'm probably, me and my colleague Tim Wilson are the only people who really truly believe that we don't have access to our cognitive processes. And often when people will ask me, why did you do that? If it's a psychologist, I say, well, let me remind you that I'm Nisbett of Nisbett and Wilson. And anything I tell you right now is fabrication. I hope it's true. It might well be true, but.
Well, I mean, I think that gets to the point that we tend to rationalize our decision making, right? That's basically what you're saying. We don't necessarily understand all of the factors that go into those decision making, but for whatever reason, we as humans tend to have that feeling that we need to be able to say and justify why I did what I did or made the decision that I made. Thoughts on that?
Tim did some wonderful studies showing that at least some kinds of judgments are better handled by the unconscious mind. And if you bring the conscious mind into it, you make a worse decision. So even like people making judgments about which of these 4 jams would you like to take home with you, they make a judgment. And then how good a judgment it is because you can ask them later how much they enjoyed it, or how much other people enjoyed it who've never been asked about it. What's the best. Which is the best jam. But if you ask people to think from it, to tell me what exactly it is about each jam, what the flavor is, what the aroma is, what the feeling of it, tell me all of its attributes, and then have them make the judgment. They make worse judgments. They pick the wrong jam. And it's the same thing with an apartment. You can say, you have 2 apartments, choose between 2 apartments, and they differ on 5 or 6 different dimensions. size, cost, attractiveness, location, etc. If you have people think out loud about each of those attributes, they're more likely to pick the wrong apartment. If they just look at it and make the judgment, they do better. So how widespread this effect is, that is how many decisions are better made without dragging the conscious mind into it, we don't really know yet. But I mean, we know there is such a phenomenon as making a worse judgment because you focus consciously on attributes of the object.
And is that related to anything from Kahneman in his System 1 versus System 2 thinking? And are they related in any way? I mean, is it just the System 1 taking over in certain instances where that's a better way of doing that, or?
Yeah, it is related. I mean, oddly, I might have come up with that terminology. Speaking of Kahneman, the reviewer on our paper, there were 3 reviewers at Psychological Review, which is the major psychology paper, 3 reviewers of that paper, which was a very long paper. At one point, he only had 2 reviews in, and the editor accidentally put the rejection letter in the letter which Tim Wilson opened to his shock, and underneath it was the review by Kahneman, which came in very late, and then the review was, "Oh, fine, we'll take it." Kahneman's the main thing Kahneman did for that paper, and it was huge, was to say, "Yeah, it's too long, but don't change a single word because you need the whole list of facts and the whole theory that has to be there to be convincing." Clinical psychologists and philosophers tended to reject the conclusion of the paper early on, but that didn't last long. And now everybody knows the basic idea there that we're blind to many of our cognitive processes.
Early on in your career, you made a note in the book. You said at one point you were working in a vacuum, and there was a sense that I got from that almost sounded like you sort of intuitively knew that you needed collaborators or wanted collaborators. And of course, much of your work has been done in collaboration. At the same time, you said, if you're going to be an academic, it helps to foster originality into things that other people don't know. So how does this, can you help me sort of balance this idea that on one hand, you need to be specialized and be expert in something that others are not, and you also need to, or desire to collaborate with others?
Right. Well, everybody brings something different to the party. And I have this notion that new disciplines are formed at the intersection or the point of contact of 2 different disciplines. And I think that's because actually the behavioral economics story is quite interesting, because the president of the Russell Sage Foundation, which brings academics to New York to write their book for a year, he became aware of this work that Kahneman and Tversky and Ross and I were doing on cognition, showing that people's choices are often suboptimal, and we don't have a clear access to what they are, and we can't often give a correct rational explanation of them, and so on. And economists had this archaic 200-year-old theory, which Thaler now mocks by saying, here's what people do, and here's what econs do. Right. So he brought these people together, and that was the birth of behavioral economics.
George Lowenstein once told me that he had a chance to talk to Amos Tversky when he was going into grad school. And George said he was interested in psychology, and Tversky said, "We need economists in this field. You need to take your psychology interest, but bring it to the field of economics."
I wonder when that was. Do you recall when that was? The year, or approximately, even?
Probably.
Well, when was George going into
they did
school?
They did CASBAs in the 90s. I would guess that was in the 70s, early 70s.
Wow. I actually didn't know that Amos was thinking about economics that early. But Oh gosh, why not? I mean, he was focusing on choice. I mean, as his so
Yeah.
that's what microeconomics is all about.
Well, you talked about this bringing in different disciplines and different things, and at the University of Michigan, it seemed like, at least from what you described in the book, you had all of these different opportunities to work with a variety of different people from different disciplines, and Amos was one of those at that point. I forget what it was, Box, or one of the different, all the different acronyms that you had for the different working pieces. How did that come about at the University of Michigan, and what kind of values do you think that brought to not just the university, but the people working on those?
Well, it's an extremely interesting question. I'm not confident of my answer, but I will tell you that Michigan is unique in the extent to which it had all kinds of groups form. I mean, the Bach group that you're referring to had a philosopher, an artificial intelligence person, an economist, and a mathematician. And that group ultimately gave rise to the complex adaptive systems program, which is now based at Michigan and at the Santa Fe Institute. And physicists are involved in that, deeply involved in the complex systems stuff. I've been in a dozen different groups. I mean, one composed of that same artificial intelligence guy and another philosopher and a cognitive psychologist. I mean, just get together and talk, and see what happens. And we realized that the major theme in our work for each of us was induction. That is, making inferences about the world. And we wrote a book on induction. And then I have the sad story. I have 15 years after the book was written, I asked a really terrific cognitive psychologist, I said, tell me, do you think what kind of impact that book had? And he said, well, it was a book you should read if you were interested in induction. I said, oh, okay. And then I say in the book, well, but really, it is a book you should read if you're interested in it.
Yeah, right.
These things don't always produce, great outcomes, but you never know in advance.
So to what degree do you think we are able to teach people about becoming better at reasoning?
Well, that's interesting because I did all these studies showing the errors in reasoning that people make, not using the base rate, failure to understand the law of large numbers, which is that you need more and more evidence in order to become more and more confident. And that's especially true when you're looking at an object or an event that's variable in nature. And you know that, then you've got to get more evidence and so on. And I used to say, not only are we stupid, but you can't make us smarter. and I now going back after all the research, where's that came from? It was dogma in psychology. Partly it came from Piaget.
Yeah.
Some basic rules of reasoning, which are wired in, they just come genetically. The rest have to be induced. You can't teach. You can't just plop these rules down on top of people. They have to induce them. He had not a shred of evidence for that. And there was no other psychologist that had evidence worth a darn for that. But I believed it because, Piaget is a smart guy. I mean, who am I to contradict Piaget? So I decided to show, indeed, I'm right. We're dumb. Can't make us smarter. So I started doing research, testing that idea. And to my astonishment, you can teach these ideas which are profoundly important, but which we have an insufficient grasp of. Everybody understands the law of large numbers in some sense, and everybody can apply it in fairly complex issues in areas where they're genuinely expert, where they really know the territory. But to give you an example of how it may or may not be used, if you ask a University of Michigan freshman on the first day of class, you say, early on in the baseball season, there are usually several batters who have averages, notably over 300, but nobody ever finishes the season that high. Why do you suppose that is? They'll say, well, the pitchers make the necessary adjustments, or maybe these very successful batters, they get cocky. If they've had a statistics course, they'll say, "Oh, how many at-bats have you had?" I mean, the clincher is after your first at-bat, your batting average is either 0 or 1. I mean,
Yeah.
So extreme scores, and this has a million ramifications. Extreme scores tend to be rare if events are distributed at all normally. I mean, if you remember, the average is the top, and that's where that's where the action is. And extreme scores tend to be rare, and that point leads to another one, the tie-in between law of large numbers and the bell curve and the concept of regression to the mean.
Mm-hmm.
Every time I had a graduate student who I thought was absolutely fantastic, the person is brilliant, it's going to be the next Tversky, they turned out to be very good psychologists. They didn't turn out to be the next Tversky. So some of my less generous acquaintances might say I'm opinionated. So I see an event, that's the way it is. Maybe not. That was very striking to me. You take a statistics course, and the statistics course never talks about baseball. In fact, the shame of it is that statistics courses don't talk about interesting everyday life events at all, and a terrible mistake. They'll probably say, a statistician will probably say, and I've heard them say this, well, there's so much darn stuff to teach, the standard deviation, blah, blah, blah. I say, yeah, you could teach that stuff more effectively if you used everyday life examples, and then they'll escape much more readily into everyday life. Psychology majors increase by 70% in their ability to solve simple little problems like that baseball problem. Chemistry majors don't improve one bit. English majors don't improve one bit. At one point, looked at medical students to see, do they get better at statistical and probabilistic reasoning? And sure enough, they do. And I said, well, wait, what? They're dissecting bodies and learning about why are they getting better? So I went to medical school for a little while, and it became totally obvious. I mean, the diagnosis classes are all about statistics and probability. And one of the teachers that gave me an idea that I absolutely love, he says, when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras.
Mm.
In other words, it's probably the most common thing. Don't come up with page 372 of infectious diseases. I mean, maybe the guy has the flu.
But that goes into some of the aspects of that, right? That if you had just seen a picture of a zebra, and it's top of mind, right. Even it gets into some of the work that you were looking at and different pieces of this is like, oh, well, it could be a zebra then, as opposed to going, wait, how many zebras are there around me versus horses and all of those facets?
That's a good example of an experiment that people have been doing. I mean, you put people in a voting booth in a school or in a church, and the ones who are in a school are more likely to vote favorably on the school millage. The ones who are in the church are more likely to vote unfavorably on abortion. Yeah. I mean, we've got a million of them, social right. Psychologists by now, and they're actually embarrassing. I mean, it's just, that we're getting pushed around by these totally arbitrary events all the time. Fortunately, I don't actually believe that because I'm a perfectly cheerful person. But in my heart of hearts, I know that I'm just being battered and buffered by these crazy little things.
Well, one of the pieces in a lot of those studies and research is this idea of can you replicate them and the whole replication piece. And I know you have an opinion on that. So tell a little bit about your thoughts on replication and why or why isn't that a thing that we should be paying attention to or putting as much emphasis on it as has been.
Okay. I'm so glad you asked because I told you I was opinionated, and now you're going to get a dose
This
of
is what we want.
Great.
That's okay.
Bring it on.
So when this first came out, I said, what the hell? I mean, I knew there was not a serious replication problem. And here's why. I've been in the business for decades, and I can hardly think of any cases of an interesting, important study that came out and it didn't replicate. I mean, there are almost no things like that. So a big part of the reason that they came up with that is that they're sampling the pages of the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology just when it's the rage for these crazy stimulus has an effect on you that you wouldn't think it should. And they don't replicate because a very long time ago, I read a fascinating book. It was reporting on the failures of studies to replicate. And there was a criticism brought against the subliminal perception work. Mm-hmm. That is where you perceive before you perceive, or you perceive without perceiving. I mean, and people were just saying, oh, that's hooey. I mean, they really did perceive it. We now know that's not true. I mean, stuff gets in. You don't know you saw. And split seconds later, you're influenced by that thing. You don't even know that you saw it. I mean, so there's the subliminal perception thing, that's all over. But the guy said, look, it can't be just that these people really perceived the thing, and that's why it happened, because you don't get the effects when you give them supralimally. So that everybody, I saw it, I know I saw it, you don't get the effect. Well, so that means these studies that we're talking about now, there's a very small margin. The person can't be aware of the stimulus because they're not going to be so much influenced by it. They can't be totally unaware of. They fail to see it, so they're fragile. So he looks at all these fragile studies with a lot of failures of replication, and then tars the whole field of psychology with it. The work was irresponsible. First of all, he should have been able to figure that out for himself. Secondly, a lot of the so-called replications were not replications at all. I mean, there were studies, somebody did a study of attitudes toward African Americans and tried to replicate it in Italy. And guess what? Italians don't have the same attitudes toward African Americans as they do. Or another study asked people how they would feel if they were unable to answer a question in a college discussion, and this is asked to people who've never been to college. I mean, so it's, and if you, and then this is the killer. I mean, this shows the extent to which it was irresponsible. If you look at the studies that they were trying to replicate or trying not to replicate, and you look at those where they consulted with the original investigator first, those studies were 4 times as likely to replicate as the ones where they just went off half-cocked and thought they would do it. My own particular contribution to this comes from the insomnia study. And sure enough, like 15 years after the original study, a psychologist walks up to me and says, I know why your insomnia study doesn't replicate. And people who like to think show the effect, and people who don't like to think don't show the effect. And the original study was done with Yale students who are
thinkers.
They like to think. They wouldn't be at Yale if they didn't like to think. What I learned from that is that you should think of every psychology experiment as an existence proof. Once upon a time, at a particular location, with a particular kind of subject, with a particular environmental circumstances, you get this effect. A leads to B. You may want to replicate that, and the replicators that drive me crazy, they want to replicate. A study isn't any good if you can't exactly duplicate it. I mean, so you should always just, next step after you get a finding is to try and duplicate it. No, that's a waste of time. The next step after you get an effect is to do something different, which you think ought to theoretically make a difference to the phenomenon. Use a different subject population so you can broaden the principle indicated by the study. Yeah. But these people, there are departments where they're totally dominant, and they're teaching nonsense.
We talked with John Barge, who obviously was in the midst of a lot of this, and he talked a lot about the same thing. This idea that if you don't have the exact same replication, you run the risk that there's some other factor that's impacting that therefore can lead to a different result. And actually, that's really good because now you're finding out more information about this phenomena, and that's what should be studied. Is like, so why, exactly like you said, it's this cognition aspect that plays into the sleep study that you just did. So right. I fully think that there's a big miss there from a lot of different perspectives.
Physiologists go and live in another town so they can watch the guy work on the preparation so they can get the preparation right. I did research on the feeding behavior of obese people, and I was comparing it to the feeding behavior of rats, which have had a lesion to the ventromedial hypothalamus, and the similarities in the eating behavior is astonishing. So I was doing the human research, but I wanted to also do the animal research, and so I didn't know how to do the lesions. So I hired an assassin to destroy the ventromedial hypothalamus of these rats. And they didn't get fat. And I think, well, that guy must have done it wrong. So I didn't realize you only get the phenomenon with female rats, and I was using only male rats.
Wow.
If I'd spent a day in somebody's laboratory, I would have learned that and would have saved a huge amount of time. So,
yeah.
You were talking about people thinking, the people who are thinkers were more likely to actually replicate the results in the sleep study. You titled your book Thinking. What are you thinking about these days?
One of the things I think about most is what everybody's thinking about most is the destruction that's being wrought by the fact that people have different information sources. It's not even so much the disinformation on the fake news, though there is that, of course. It's the body English that gets put on, and the stuff that Facebook will admit that the communications that are most extreme are the most likely to get spread. So it's an awful situation, and I don't know what to do about it. There is one very interesting thing that's being done by somebody. He brings right-wingers and left-wingers together to talk. They tend not to be disagreeable conversations. They don't agree with each other on most of what gets talked about. But after it's all over, we say, well, it's a nice guy, but I mean, so misled. And he said, I know these people were right-wingers, or I know they were left-wingers, but they're not the crazies, the people who get on the internet and just, and actually a lot of them were the people who get on the internet and say these really super extreme things. So if you could just it's so easy to live in your cocoon. I mean, academics, you'd have to walk a long way. It's through a lot of halls in most universities to find a conservative, which is, in my opinion, too bad. But it certainly keeps academics in a cocoon where they believe the only reason. I read the Wall Street Journal, despite the fact that it can cause some indigestion sometimes. and sometimes, it really does. There are a couple of columnists there who regularly influence my opinion. One of them is Peggy Noonan, who's Ronald Reagan's previous speechwriter. She's such a level-headed person. She's very interesting on all kinds of topics which don't necessarily have a right-left ring, but a lot of it does have a conservative slant, and she's so smart. If she says it, I better think about it.
Yeah. Wow.
So I think everybody ought to feel like they need to have some input from the other side.
Well, Richard, it's an interesting concept because I've tried to do that at least with different things that I follow and doing things on social media and trying to get that different perspective because I in the same belief as you that, look, if nothing else, I would definitely want to make sure that I'm not just making assumptions about what the other side is thinking or saying versus my own view and I get stuck within this little bubble of my own. And what I found, and this is, just me, and I think I'm a pretty reasonable guy, and I think that I kind of look at this is that even when I do that, sometimes I see these things, and as you said, it's that little indigestion that you get all of a sudden. It's like you read it and you go, oh, it just makes me mad. And so then I just stop reading because I don't want to feel that anger. And I think it's a really hard thing. But yes, I don't know if there's any hints that you have about how you can, push down that indignation and just kind of say, nope, I need to read this through to basically make sure that I'm getting the full story here.
Well, there is a publication that does this. It's called The Week. Do you know about this?
I've heard about it, yeah.
They have an opinion. They're basically liberal, but every event of any importance or speech of any importance, they put in some right-wing opinions about it. You eventually get the habit of saying, oh, that's the right-winger. I don't have to pay any attention to that. But often they'll say, well, I don't know. I mean, it's certainly interesting to know what the other side is thinking.
Yeah.
I was on a bunch of social scientists who were working Clinton campaign in 2016, and we were all liberals. And Michael Moore, the documentary maker, he's from Michigan. He's working class himself, and he told anybody who would listen that Trump is going to win. Like every other liberal, we were saying, forget about it, but let's just make it a landslide as we can. We were so out of it. We didn't know who was on the other side. We didn't know why they were there. Just to be a more effective left-winger, if you're left-winger, or more effective right-winger, if you're right-winger, know what the other side is thinking. You know what the lay of the land, the territory, and if you want to persuade them, you'll have a better chance.
That's a very, very good piece of advice for us. And thank you for the mention about The Week. That is something I was not familiar with, so I'm excited to dig into that. I was curious if you were going to spend the next year on a desert island and you had to take the music of 3 artists with you. Who might you take?
Beethoven, and Beethoven.
Oh, okay.
and maybe every now and then pray for, a wave would bring in a recording by Schubert.
Okay. So you like the Romantics. Okay.
Right.
That's a good place to start. What in Beethoven's pantheon of, library of work, what would be the most favorite things?
Well, the emotion. It's just no other classical music has the kind of impact that he does. And there's a kind of grandiose streak in me that I think Beethoven brings out in everybody. So the Emperor, a concerto.
Yeah.
And some of the stuff is so just deeply moving. This second movement of the 7th Symphony. I melt whenever I hear that. Aside from that, it's the other Romantics. It's sort of, there's a sort of gap with Brahms. I love the keyboard stuff from Brahms. I'm not crazy about the symphonic stuff. Yeah. It's not sufficiently melodic. I find I'm listening to Brahms. Oh, well, that's neat. And then the next part, I suddenly realize I'm wool gathering. I'm not really paying attention. The same thing is true of Wagner's music. You know what Mark Twain said about Wagner's music? It's better than it sounds.
well, that's what if you think about emotion, and he just gets bombastic.
Yeah, right. Bombastic, right. That's over the line for me.
All right, Richard, I have a follow-up to that. So you're on the island, you're listening to Beethoven. Who would be the researcher that you would like to have there to have as you're beyond listening to the music, that you're having some intellectual conversations with? And that person could be alive or, obviously anybody in the past century or 2 centuries. So,
well, unfortunately, they're both dead. One is Amos, and the other is my friend Lee Ross, who just, anything he turned his attention to, he had interesting observations about. Sometimes at greater length than most people really wanted. But actually, I had several conversations with him on his deathbed, and he never came up for air.
Oh my God.
Talking.
Wow.
Yeah.
And everybody who knows him laughs at that. I mean, no matter how much you love him, say that. So Lee for sure, Amos for sure.
What about Amos? What is it about Amos that you would like to have that would endear you to have him a year?
Again, anything he turned his attention to, he was going to have interesting observations about. But more importantly than that, he was going to be right about. I mean, it's just okay. That's a thing I don't have to think about anymore because I know the correct opinion to have. So, that my joke that in the book, meeting Amos Tversky was an IQ test. The smarter you are, the quicker you realize this guy is smarter than you are. But it's interesting. I mean, the contrast with Kahneman is interesting because Kahneman can be wrong. I mean, he's wrong about a lot of things. Well, wrong about a lot of things about my work. I mean, we disagree. And most people would say the same thing. I mean, everybody would say the same thing about Amos. I mean, he just wasn't wrong. And I think most people who know Danny would say he often is wrong. But that's not a criticism for me. I mean, I think it's part of why he's so creative. If you're climbing out a limb often enough, you're gonna saw yourself off one of these days. I used to say about Amos that if it weren't for Danny, Amos would have been the world's greatest mathematical psychologist. Period. I mean, he was that anyway, but I mean, so much more. I mean, he was a Nobel Prize-winning economist.
Yeah.
And you know the anecdote, which I got from Michael Lewis, about Amos being at a party being given for a physicist who had just been given the second highest award in physics. And Amos talked with a guy for an hour or two, and at the end of it, he asked a friend, said, "Who was that physicist I was talking to so much?" He says, "Oh, he's not a physicist, he's a psychologist." And the physicist, impossible. That's the smartest. He was the smartest physicist in the room.
Wow.
So that's the kind of mind we're talking about. Yeah. And that's why it takes you not that long to figure out that this guy is on a different planet. I mean, so.
Richard, we are so grateful for your time. We can't express our gratitude deeply enough for you taking time to chat with us today. And thank you for being a guest on Behavioral Grooves.
Thanks. Well, it's great fun for me, obviously. Thank you.
Welcome to our grooving session where Tim and I groove on what we learned from our discussion with Richard, have a free-flowing conversation, and talk about whatever else comes into our thinking about thinking brains.
Yeah, that's like the big takeaway for me. And I just got to say, this is like the month of hits. Zimbardo, Barge, Nisbett. Oh, man, it's fantastic.
It is awesome. I am we are so lucky. It is really, truly a pleasure and an honor to be able to interview these people and to talk to them and learn from them. And I think that's fantastic.
I just got to say, and how great is it that when we have guests on, that automatically, without any encouragement, just naturally and organically bring up your hero, Kurt Lewin.
Yes, they do. Well, because Lewin is a luminary in this field. He was a groundbreaker, a pioneer, whatever other adjective or word that you can use to describe him. And I think, as Richard said, there's this idea that he's really underappreciated. I think that there are this idea of force field analysis, of driving and restraining forces, is just powerful. It's simple, but it's powerful. His behavior model, B equals P. I'm gonna mess it up now. But
the math would be lost on me. So don't.
Well, it's really not a hard. It's the person and the situation. And so it's about the environment, P and E. And so there's just a lot of value in being able to look back at some of these people who have done research in the past that maybe not necessarily was overlooked, but, could be brought back into today to say what has changed, because I think some things have changed, but what is still consistent? And those I think are really interesting conversations to have.
can we also say that it's pretty cool that in our conversation with Zimbardo and our conversation with John Barge and our conversation with Richard Nisbett, all three of them, again, also brought up Henry Milgram and his work. And I love that, again, just these are the greats. If you are interested in behavioral science and you're not reading their original works, get out and just check them out, because it's just fantastic. They're amazing thinkers.
Well, and again, I think what all of these guys are studying and looking at is human behavior, why we do what we do. And this idea that it was because of who we are was the prevailing kind of aspect. And what Milgram, what Lewin even talked about with his, the environment that you're in, and what Zimbardo did, all of them showed that as much as we would predict behavior being based upon who we are, our actual behavior is driven much more by the situation that we find ourselves within.
Yeah.
And that's the context piece that this month is about, that we are influenced by the things that are happening around us, the social norms that are prevalent in the society that we live in, the physicality of the environment, the expectations of a certain role, the authority figure or non-authority figure that is telling us or asking us to do something. All of those are really powerful motivators and influence what we do.
Yeah. So not only are we not aware of what we would do, it's very difficult for us to predict exactly how we will behave in any specific situation. When we do it, we're not aware of why we do it. We don't connect to why. The pantyhose study with having 4 sets of pantyhose lined up and just please choose which you think, and to think that the one that's on the far right has a 4 times greater likelihood of being chosen, and people can't explain why, and it just has to do with the location. Mm-hmm. It was location only. That's a fantastic study.
Well, and going beyond that, even beyond that, like when you go back and talk to people about it and say, well, it's the location, isn't it? They would say, no, that is not it.
Right. That's right.
This idea, and even if you said, well, a bunch of other people, did this, and then this is what we are hypothesizing that it is this, they're still saying, well, no, maybe for others, but not for me. Right. And that, I think, is a big insight, is that we are not good. We are hugely deficient in our ability to understand why we do what we do.
Especially in the moment.
Particularly in the moment, but even upon reflection, because our brains work in such a way that we rationalize our decisions, that we rationalize these, choosing the pantyhose because they're on the end with some other thing. Well, no, the texture was better. I like the packaging. It was cheaper. It was whatever the reason is. And once we hold that belief, we have confirmation bias. And so by allowing that it could be something else, we fight against that. And so even in reflection, it's very difficult. But yes, definitely in the moment.
Yeah. Nisbett said, when you ask me, he said, anything I tell you right now is fabrication. What a great word.
I hope it's true, but it may not well be. Yeah.
That's right.
Which again, we've talked to people about memory, and memory is such a interesting facet too, that we create memory every time. It's not something that's a video in our head that we just rewind and play. It's actually being actively created every time. And so it gets changed, it gets modified. And so even in memory, we have these differences that come in, which is a whole separate topic. And we should have a month on memory at one point.
We need to do that. We absolutely need to do that because it is fascinating. One of the things that I found really fascinating was this idea that you can make a worse judgment because you focus on something consciously, like sort of the cost benefit analysis thing. I don't think he explained it enough in our conversation, but the idea is that when whatever decision we're making, let's say we're going to buy a refrigerator, and we're going to go through a cost benefit analysis of 3 of refrigerators because we've narrowed it down. That Nisbett says that if we were to make that decision right then and there in that moment of doing that cost benefit analysis, we're likely to make more mistakes than if we just sit on it for a while. Let our subconscious, our unconscious, do some of the work. Let it do some processing. And by giving our unconscious time to do some processing, we make better decisions. We'll actually come out better. And of course, we won't know the difference, right? We won't be aware of it, but that people end up being more satisfied with their decisions when they give those, especially large decisions, time to percolate a little bit. And I think that that's a really important message to take away. And I think he kind of worked through it pretty quickly in our conversation. So that's why I wanted to return to it, because I find it fascinating and it's a good life lesson.
Yeah, the idea that even if we're very quantitative in looking at things, it reminds me, Tim, of this idea that you go into a audio store, right? And you're listening to 2 different sets of speakers. And because you're comparing them right to left and they're right there. And I don't know, maybe did Richard talk about this? Somebody talked about this before, but this idea that you hear, one sounds a little better, right? But if you put those speakers in your house, you would have no way of being able to discern that without having them, comparing right side by side. But what you do notice is that the speakers you bought are huge and I don't fit into my living room. And I could have got those smaller speakers that would have fit really nice on that shelf and wouldn't have made such a big craziness piece of this. And so those comparisons of what we're doing and how we're going to understand and how it's going to actually impact us in the future, again, we're poor at being able to predict that.
And I just want to make a note, man. You're talking about pre-1978 stuff because there hasn't been like a store with speakers in it since I don't know when. I don't know when.
Oh, man.
Okay. What else did you want to groove on?
Well, it's hard to admit you're wrong, but it's probably a good thing to do. And even Nisbett admits to being wrong.
Yeah.
And that, particularly as he was saying, you can't teach people new ideas. And then he's like, oh, well, I guess the research shows that. And I appreciate that in many of the researchers that we've talked to, the luminary kind of researchers that we've talked to. Gary Latham is, again, I think the best example of this in this idea, like telling his research assistant, hey, if this proves right, I'll eat the paper that it's printed out on. And then it proves right. And he's like, oh, crap,
I got to eat the computer paper.
But he changed his perspective and he admitted that he was wrong, that his preconceived ideas were not what actually the data showed. And I think that's a really good life lesson. And it's one that we talked about with John Barge. I think it's something that kind of was underwritten in the idea that we talked with Zimbardo. But this idea that we hold these beliefs, yet when we're faced with contradictory evidence, confirmation bias kicks in, a number of other biases kick in, and we hold strongly to those, as opposed to just saying, yeah, I was wrong. I need to admit that and move on.
Yeah. When I get new evidence, when I get new data, I change my mind. What do you do? Mm-hmm. That's the question that continues to stand out in my mind. What do you do? I think that's an important part of it. How about the replication crisis? What did you think of that?
Again, I think the nomenclature around replication crisis is all wrong. It's not a crisis. It's a replication adventure. It's a replication enhancement. It is all of these things.
It's like a Disney ride.
Well, no. Yes, and I should be saying, right? Yes, and if anything, I said no right away. I need to go, yes, and it's not like a Disney ride. It's like But the idea that he brought up, that we interviewed him a while ago, and so this has been percolating in my head over and over again, and I've brought it up a couple different times in other interviews, but it's this idea that, hey, I can hardly think of a case that wasn't interesting that hasn't been replicated, is one of the things he said. Yep. But I think even more importantly, the thing that I've been percolating on is this, that you should think of and I'm quoting here, you should think of every psychological experiment as an existence of proof that once upon a time at a particular location with a particular kind of subject or a particular environmental circumstances, you get this effect that A leads to B.
That's
and
it.
Unless people were p-hacking or fabricating data or being just totally wrong in their statistical analysis of this, that is true. That in this situation, in this context with these people, A led to B. Now, I think the issue is trying to understand why A led to B. And we don't always understand why A leads to B or what can confound that A leads to B in these situations. But if you just change this one thing, then A doesn't lead to B anymore. But let's find out what that one thing is, because that is great. And I think the issue that comes into play many times is that we generalize these results to a much bigger, broader perspective. And in fact, we shouldn't. We need to keep doing these experiments to fully understand how A impacts B and what are the confounding factors and when does it work and when doesn't it. And a replication that doesn't happen, look at that. Is it an exact replication? What has changed? John Barge talked about this. The idea of priming, you have to have that idea in your head before. So if the social norms around something have changed and you're trying to prime a social norm, well, you can't prime a social norm from the 1980s if that social norm is no longer around, that social belief. So there's a number of those factors that come into play. But I love this idea of that it's a proof, an existence of proof.
It reminds me of our conversation with Channing Jiang from the Busara Institute when he talked about how in the United States, the public presentation stress test is a big deal. It raises cortisol, like in just about everybody, to have to stand up in front of a group of experts and make a presentation. But it didn't replicate in Kenya. And that's because when the Kenyans participants came out in front of the experts, they're wearing white lab coats. And in the United States, it looks like an expert. In Kenya, that's what the butchers wear. Yeah. So they were like, I'm not afraid to talk to the butcher. That's not a big deal. So it's not that it didn't replicate per se. It's just different. We're getting more evidence about how unique and interesting and individual our social norms are, our cultures are, the way we look at things.
It's about context. It is about the environmental and the social context, which is what this month is about. And
absolutely.
I love this idea that it's easy for us to be seduced into generalizing every study that we read. And I know you wrote those words down, but I get to read them, and I love that fact. But this idea that we are seduced to say, well, if this happened here, then it applies across this wider swath. And we need to not do that as much. We need to be more contained in our enthusiasm.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, can I just close on Beethoven?
Okay.
And this does relate to context, but
okay.
But Nisbett talked about the Emperor's Concerto. It's Beethoven's fifth piano concerto, and it was his last piano concerto, by the way. It's an amazingly bombastic piece. It's huge. Beethoven wrote it while he was in Vienna as Napoleon's army from France is marching into the city. Literally, he's writing it at that time. And Beethoven was losing his hearing, and so all he could hear were like the big booms of, bombs and things like that. But it is the context. If you listen to that piece, you can just about hear the marching of the aggressing army coming into the city. It's not a march, but you hear that kind of vibe, that intensity in this concerto, and it's a fantastic piece. So context matters even to artists.
I'm going to have to listen to that, and now with that as a frame, I'll probably hear it very differently, which again, my context on this has changed. So thank you, Tim.
Good.
All right. So think we should wrap that up? It's about time.
I think it is. We hope that you'll join us next week for our episode with Fadi Maki, the managing director of Nudge Lebanon. His agency is applying behavioral science in war-torn countries, and Fadi is often recognized as the leading authority on behavioral science in the Middle East. We are excited to be sharing our conversation with him.
We are super excited about that. And we're very excited to share out our conversation with you. But we have to let you know that next week is our 250th episode. So that's a pretty cool milestone. I'm pretty glad we made it, Tim. After our first one, do you think we would have ever made 250?
No, not at all.
It's going to be a not so huge celebration, but maybe if you announce it out, maybe more people will listen, and we would really, really appreciate that. And we hope that you'll join us for it as well.
Yeah, we certainly hope that you do. And in the meantime, between now and then, we hope you go out and find your groove.